This is part 2 of a two-part series. Part 1 covered the reasons for Old Testament servitude, why it was needed, and some of the differences between this servitude and Roman and transatlantic slavery. In Part 1, we also explored the use of the Jesus Old Testament window to help clarify some laws, and also the importance of understanding case laws and how they worked. I would encourage you, if not already, to watch Part 1, which can be found here. Part 2 will build on the topics covered in Part 1. So, what, if any, protection did servants have against oppression by employees? Old Testament servants had legally protected rights, so employers could not, for example, rape, use forced work, or beat up their employed servants whenever they wanted. Oppression of servants was strictly forbidden in the law. For example, we read in Deuteronomy 24:14 of a hard worker. You shall not oppress a hard worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. Additionally, there were various strong protective laws against all forms of rape. Moreover, the Old Testament assumes that sexual relationships were within the bond of a marriage between a husband and a wife. See Genesis 2:24, which states, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Click on the link above to see my video on marriage for further information on Jesus' teaching on marriage. Dr. Paul Copan adds that in the case of a post-battle situation, rape was also strictly forbidden and punished under Old Testament Bible law in Deuteronomy 21. Women were not to be understood as commodities or objects to be used. There is an elevated, redemptive and moral picture to what God expected before, during and after any battle. In addition to legal protection against sexual assault or oppressive behaviour, Copan comments that an Israelite household was obliged to provide economic security, food, clothing and shelter to their servants. Servants were legally entitled to and employers obliged to give these protected rights. For example, wages were to be paid on the same day. Again, in Deuteronomy 24:15 we read, You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. Servants were also legally required to be given a day off a week to rest. In Exodus 21:10 we read, The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. What about a protection against physical injury or death? In Exodus 21:20-21 we read a case law which states, When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. If an employer of the servant strikes him so he dies, the case law required that he be avenged. The word avenge here is the Hebrew word nakam, which is commonly used for the death sentence. The word nakam, vengeance, does not apply to property damage in Israel. So the servant is not property, but has rights as a human being, including judges calling for the death sentence to the servant's employer if he strikes him so that he dies after 1 or 2 days. Importantly, the biblical text doesn't say the employer will go unpunished, just that the employer won't face the nakam death penalty. But specifically, in context and later, in that same chapter in verses 26 and 27, injuring a servant, knocking out a tooth, gouging out an eye, calls for release of the servant without any lingering debt. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. But this is not meant to read a literal eye or tooth. In the Lex Talionis, the law of retaliation, eye for eye, tooth for tooth was meant to be metaphorical and not literal punishment, with the exception of life for life. The Lex Talionis was designed as a way of legislating a proportional judicial response to a crime. Specifically, in this case, the law commanded that the injured servant was to be released without debt. What about the case of runaway servants? Foreign runaway slaves from outside Israel could legally flee to Israel and attach themselves to be acquired by Israelite households. Copan adds that, as can be seen in Deuteronomy 23, 15 and 16, an abused servant within Israel could legally flee and gain legal protection from an oppressive employer just as much as an abused foreign slave outside could run away to Israel to seek legal refuge. The law clearly stated that he could not harshly treat this person, and the servant was legally permitted to choose where to live and work. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. As we have seen earlier, harsh physical treatment of a native Israelite or alien was legally forbidden. Dr. David Clines, cited in Copan, goes further and argues that this would also apply to any Israelite servant who was being treated harshly. What is amazing about the law of the fugitive servant or foreign runaway slave is that it enables a servant or slave to acquire their own freedom by the relatively simple expedient of runaway. A servant or a slave can choose not to be a servant or slave. What about kidnapping? Kidnapping was strictly forbidden, and anyone who kidnapped another person for sale, and also the person who owned a kidnapped person, faced potentially the death penalty. The law in Exodus 21:16 states, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." What about the word property, sometimes used in some translations? In Leviticus 25:44 we read that, "As for your male and female slaves whom you have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you." Copan details that foreign servants may be acquired, voluntarily coming to Israel to work for a better life or as a runaway seeking refuge in Israel, or perhaps because of famine or defeat in war. Where the meaning of buy here is in this context is acquired. Baker goes on to say, cited in Copan, that acquiring was not forcible, but the servant selling himself, such as in Leviticus 25:39a. "If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you." This is a contractual agreement here, where the servant voluntarily sells his services. No kidnapping, compulsion, or third-party seller is involved at all. Likewise, the Old Testament used contractual language for persons, both Israelite and non-Israelite, such as, "Here's his silver." For example, in Exodus 21 we read, "For the slave is his money." So this law is a reminder that the servant is the employer's money or silver as an investment. The servant voluntarily sells himself and the employer acquires his contracted services. Copan adds that an Israelite may purchase or acquire, the word kana, a fellow Israelite who is impoverished. Just because an Israelite is acquired, this doesn't diminish his status as a dignified human being. A foreigner who was acquired is not diminished in dignity either. How were immigrants in Israel required to be treated? The sojourner or stranger, an alien or the immigrant, had come from another land, seeking refuge for political or economic reasons, and was settled for some time. So-called foreigners were, as discussed earlier in part 1, either escaping famine, voluntarily entering for business, prisoners of war, or escaping harsh treatment in another country. In the books of Deuteronomy and Exodus, the Israelites were reminded of how they were once poorly treated and abused slaves in Egypt, and hence the law commanded love to be expressed towards the sojourner and not mistreatment. For example, in Deuteronomy 10:18-19 we read, "He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." And in Exodus 21:21 we read, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." In fact, there are 36 express commands not to mistreat alien immigrants. Are Israelites and non-Israelite citizens treated any differently? Copan's research shows virtually no different treatment between Israelite and non-Israelite servants. There were strict enforceable protective limits. Both Israelites and non-Israelites were called servants and could be acquired. Both could improve themselves and prosper, and both may be in service for a maximum of 2 generations within a household and not forever. Also, poor Israelites could also be acquired by a foreigner to whom they could sell themselves, or mokar, as servants. What about permanent servitude? We read in Leviticus 25 that a foreign servant could contract himself out to work for an Israelite family, potentially permanently. Here, the Hebrew word used is Olam. We also read that a servant could also improve themselves and prosper. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother besides him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan. Additionally, we read in Exodus 21, Israelites themselves could also voluntarily enter into a permanent, or Olam, relationship of servitude out of love for their employer. Dr. John Goldingray, cited in Copan, shares that a servant's situation could be secure and reasonably comfortable, and one can even imagine people who started off as a debt servant volunteering to become permanent servants because they love their master and his household, and it is good for them to be with their employer. However, servitude for a foreign or Israelite servant did not have to be permanent. Notice the word may is used here. Olam service was voluntary and optional. Several legal warnings were given to Israelite employers with an Israelite servant. In Leviticus 25:43, we read that employers of servants must not rule one over another ruthlessly. However, Copan shares that this is in relation to a coercive attempt to keep that person in servitude beyond the mandated 6-year limit. Also, it doesn't follow that you still mistreat a foreign servant. The issue of restricting service to no more than 6 years is also addressed in Leviticus 25:39, where slave labour refers to a length of service and not type of service. Copan adds that because aliens couldn't own land but could attach themselves to Israelite families, their permanent service was assumed. This could be a good and secure arrangement, and within a generation or two, foreigners in Israel were typically assimilated into the broader culture of the host country, taking on new names, intermarrying, and adopting new customs. See 1 Chronicles 2:34-35. To keep foreign servants generation after generation was not how things worked in ancient Near East. As we discussed earlier, foreigners' permanent or Olam servitude was for one of possibly 2 generations maximum. But as we have also seen, aliens could grow rich and improve their lot, to the point of even acquiring an Israelite servant. were servants in a permanent cycle of poverty. Leviticus 25 also makes it clear that the stranger who lives among you as a sojourner could climb the economic ladder and prosper, Nazak, verse 47, such that he, the foreigner, could actually acquire, or canna, a poor Israelite who sells himself, that is, contracted himself out to the foreigner. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to the member of the stranger's clan. Verse 47 tells us that this poor Israelite could also eventually grow rich or prosper, in which case he could buy himself out of debt. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. The foreigner was not doomed to poverty, but could prosper in Israel, just as the impoverished Israelite who had to sell himself could also eventually prosper. So in conclusion, there were servants in ancient Israel. They may have been Israelites or foreign non-Israelites. However, these were not like the transatlantic slave trade or Roman slaves. Apart from the exception of prisoners of war, the servitude was voluntary and not race-based. The purpose was to mainly either to provide a way for servants to pay off debts or to provide an income for foreigners. All servants were given extensive legal rights and protection, were protected against abuse and harm, and could even potentially prosper and become wealthy.